August 26th, 1346. A muddy field near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. 9,000 exhausted Englishmen stand against 30,000 of Europe's most elite knights. The French possess every conceivable advantage: superior numbers, heavy cavalry, the very flower of European nobility in their ranks. Their confidence runs so deep that French lords openly argue over who will claim the honour of capturing Edward III alive, debating the ransom amount before a single arrow has flown. Princes calculate their share of the reward. Dukes discuss the logistics of transporting the English king back to Paris in chains. The arrogance is suffocating. 4 hours later, the conversation has changed entirely. 1,500 French nobles lie dead in the mud. Princes, dukes, kings. The English have lost 40 men, not 400, 40. In a single afternoon, 5 centuries of armoured dominance collapsed completely, dismantled by peasants with sticks and string. The blind King of Bohemia charged straight into death because blindness couldn't stop his desire to strike one final blow for glory. French knights trampled their own men in panic, crushing allies into the mud in their desperation to flee. The Genoese crossbowmen hired to support them were massacred by the very nobles who commanded them. For weeks afterward, crows gorged themselves so thoroughly on noble flesh that they couldn't fly, waddling between corpses too heavy to lift from the ground. Peasants reported seeing them hop from body to body, bloated and immobile. This is the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare died in the mud, when the entire philosophical foundation of nobility was destroyed by common-born archers, and when the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most catastrophic defeat. If you enjoy these dark history stories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. Now, let's understand how a weapon worth 10 shillings destroyed armour, valued at £1,000, how French nobles murdered their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how one blind king's suicidal charge became the most tragically noble death in military history. This is a story about the moment when technology proved more powerful than bloodline, when discipline beat arrogance, and when the medieval world was shattered on a rainy afternoon in France. Let's establish the context. Edward III of England had recently landed in Normandy with approximately 15,000 men, asserting his claim to the French throne through his mother's lineage. The legitimacy of his claim mattered less than the opportunity. He'd spent weeks carving a path of devastation across northern France in what was called a chevauchée, essentially legalised vandalism designed to demonstrate the French king's inability to protect his own subjects. Villages burned, crops were torched, livestock was driven off or slaughtered, the countryside bled. Wealth in every direction Edward's army marched. Entire regions were rendered barren. The English had recently sacked Caen, looting the city completely, and were now attempting to escape northward toward the English-held port of Calais, when French intelligence finally located them. Philip VI of France had assembled what contemporary chroniclers described as the greatest army in Christendom. We're discussing 30 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights in full-plate armour mounted on armoured destriers that themselves weighed as much as a modern automobile. A fully armoured knight and horse together approached 1 ton. This wasn't merely a military force. Nearly every significant noble in France was present. The King of Bohemia arrived with his court and his entourage. The Holy Roman Empire sent contingents. Moravia contributed knights. Allies from across Europe gathered, united by a single objective: English blood and the capture of Edward III for ransom. This wasn't competition for them. It was opportunity. They genuinely believed victory was inevitable. The French knight of this era was essentially the tank of medieval warfare. A fully armoured warrior on an armoured horse weighed nearly a ton, draped in steel from head to toe. These men had been raised from infancy specifically for combat. They trained with weapons before they learned to read. Noble children exercised on horseback before they could walk properly. Their armour alone cost more wealth than an entire peasant village would accumulate in a lifetime. The finest suits of plate armour could cost £50 sterling, more than a labourer would earn in 50 years of work. For 500 years, the thunder of cavalry charges had decided the outcome of European battles. Infantry existed primarily to be trampled. Archers were considered annoyances, barely worthy of the nobility's attention. True warfare, in the French understanding, was conducted by mounted knights wielding lances and swords. A peasant archer was barely more than a nuisance, a distraction from the real business of war between noble warriors. And yet Edward III possessed something the French actively despised: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. Most were peasants, some were criminals. All had been practising archery since childhood, required by English law to maintain proficiency with the bow. Every Sunday after church services, English males were compelled to practice with the bow. Playing other sports was literally illegal if one could be training archery instead. Entire generations of Englishmen had grown up with bows in their hands, drawing thousands of times annually. They had built entire bodies around this single skill. The longbow itself seemed deceptively simple, a 6-foot stave of yew wood, nothing ornate or elaborate, nothing that looked particularly impressive. Yet in trained hands, it transformed into something devastating. A practiced archer could loose 12 arrows per minute, striking targets at distances of 250 yards with remarkable accuracy. That's an arrow every 5 seconds from roughly 2.5 football fields away, striking with precision. The draw weight was enormous, between 150 and 180 pounds. That means pulling the bowstring required the force of drawing 100.5 pounds of resistance. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from this period can identify longbow archers by their deformed skeletons. The left arm was commonly inches longer than the right, the muscle and bone warped by decades of drawing that immense weight. The archer's shoulders became asymmetrical, one dramatically larger than the other from the constant repetitive strain. The spine curved differently, adapted to the asymmetrical pulling motion. The skeleton itself told the story of a life spent in service to this single weapon. These weren't just soldiers, they were specialists, their very bodies transformed by their calling. Edward understood something critical that the French did not. The age of mounted knights was ending. When he arranged his forces on high ground near Crécy, he made a decision that shocked both armies. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. English nobility fighting as common infantry. It was unprecedented, obscene even by medieval standards. These men had trained their entire lives for the moment when they would charge on horseback. The thunder of hooves beneath them, the lance couched against their armour, the glorious impact of collision at full speed. Their war horses were worth more than gold, literally. A destrier, a true war horse, could cost more than a small manor. Dismounting them was considered a profound insult to centuries of military tradition and noble identity. Edward was asking them to abandon everything they'd been trained for. The shock waves rippled through Edward's own ranks. But Edward was clear. Survival mattered more than pride. Only the living would keep their honour. One by one, knights in polished plate armour began trudging into the mud beside archers in woolen hoods. It was a sight no one in Christendom had witnessed before. Nobility fighting as common infantry. This was radical. This was the king telling his nobles that they were wrong, that everything they believed about warfare was wrong. Edward positioned his army carefully, demonstrating tactical sophistication that stood in sharp contrast to French improvisation. 3 divisions with the archers forming a V-shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire. If the enemy penetrated one section, archers from adjacent positions could still target them. He'd also ordered his men to fortify the position during the night march. Ditches were dug, sharpened stakes were driven into the earth at angles specifically designed to impale charging horses. Holes and pits disrupted the open ground, creating obstacles for cavalry. The entire hillside had been transformed into a carefully engineered killing field while the French were still marching. The English were treating the battlefield as an engineering problem, something to be designed and constructed. The French were treating it as a stage for glory. The night before battle was remarkable for how it revealed the character of both forces. The English camp was eerily disciplined. Archers tended their bows methodically, rubbing beeswax into the strings to protect them from moisture. They understood that everything depended on those weapons functioning perfectly. Stakes were hammered into the earth by torchlight. Men checked their positions, their supplies, their ammunition. Chronicles describe Edward distributing meat and ale, substantial food, so his men would sleep with full stomachs the night before combat. The English were rested and fed. They'd arrived early enough to prepare properly. They'd slept on full stomachs before their greatest battle. Meanwhile, the French army staggered into camp after a punishing forced march covering 20 miles. hungry and exhausted. They'd been in constant motion for hours. They'd lost the luxury of rest and preparation because the nobility had insisted on pursuing the English immediately, unwilling to wait even one day. Discipline versus arrogance, preparation versus pride. These differences would prove consequential when the fighting started. Across the valley, the French camp was chaos dressed in silk and gold. Nobles paraded past each other in gleaming armour, banners snapping dramatically in the wind, each competitor determined to outshine the others. Dukes and counts squabbled openly about who would lead the charge or who would have the honour of capturing Edward alive for ransom. Arguing voices filled the night. Some boasted they'd drag the English king back in chains before nightfall, transforming him into a prisoner whose ransom would make them the wealthiest men in France. Philip VI's repeated attempts to impose order were drowned out by the clamour of horns, drums, and endless boasting. The gathering resembled a tournament gone mad more than a disciplined military force preparing for serious battle. There was almost festive atmosphere, a sense that victory was so assured that the details of glory could be sorted out beforehand. When dawn broke on August 26, 1346, the French vanguard advanced through the smouldering wreckage left by Edward's chevauchée. Villages still burned, crops lay in ash, livestock was scattered across fields that should have been productive. Peasants muttered curses as they watched thousands of armoured knights thunder past the ruins of their homes. Some wept at the destruction. Others watched with blank stares, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. To the French nobility, this devastation was an intolerable insult demanding immediate vengeance. Honour demanded they attack. To the English, it was proof that their strategy was working. They had turned the land itself into a weapon, demonstrating that the French king couldn't protect his people or his resources. The destruction proved that English power extended into French territory. It was psychological warfare made physical. Philip VI's army reached Crécy around 4 in the afternoon, utterly exhausted after the long march. The sensible decision would have been to rest and position the army properly, launching an attack at dawn when the French would be fresh and the English sleep-deprived. Philip actually issued an order to halt. Reconnaissance showed the English position. Experienced commanders recommended waiting. But patience was not a virtue the French nobility possessed. Strategic thinking was for lesser commanders. They saw the English perched on that hill, outnumbered 3-1, exhausted from weeks of raiding, short on supplies, positioned defensively but vulnerable. The French smelled glory. They wanted it now. Debate erupted among the nobles about who should have the honour of leading the charge. Every French lord wanted to be the one whose name entered history. The desire for personal glory and ransom money overrode military judgment. The commanders who advocated for waiting were drowned out by voices demanding immediate action. This was their moment. This was when they would become legends. Then, in mid-afternoon, dark clouds gathered. A sudden rainstorm soaked the field, and the French knights laughed confidently. Their plate armour would protect them from rain, after all. Water ran off the polished steel, but the rainstorm meant something very different to missile troops. The English calmly unstrung their bows, tucking the strings inside their helmets and beneath their cloaks to keep them dry. They understood how moisture affected their weapons. They'd trained for this. The Genoese crossbowmen had no such precaution. Their crossbow strings stretched and sagged in the moisture, becoming less responsive, less deadly. Their weapons' effectiveness began deteriorating immediately. The rain was a small thing, just water falling from the sky, but it had consequences. It changed everything. As the rain eased and the sun began sinking lower, the French prepared to charge. The Genoese crossbowmen, who had been hired as mercenaries to support the French, advanced first. They were experienced soldiers, professional missile troops who had fought across Europe. They understood their job: soften up the English position before the cavalry charge, kill some English soldiers, weaken the defence. They advanced toward the English lines and fired. Their bolts flew toward the English, fewer of them now, their ammunition heavy with moisture, and their aim affected by the deteriorated strings. The distance was significant. Many bolts fell short or flew wild. The English weren't decimated. Then the English archers waited. They waited for the Genoese to reach an effective range. They waited for the perfect moment. Then 5,000 archers drew as one. What happened next shattered the Genoese completely. 12 arrows per minute from 5,000 archers equals 60,000 arrows per minute. That's 1,000 arrows per second. The sky literally darkened with missiles. Chroniclers describe the sun being blocked out by arrows. The Genoese broke immediately, dropping their crossbows and running for the rear, screaming that they were betrayed, that they couldn't possibly continue under such fire. No human could. The French knights, seeing their own mercenary troops fleeing, interpreted this as cowardice rather than recognizing that their own crossbowmen had been faced with an impossible barrage. The French aristocracy reacted with fury. They were offended by the Genoese retreat. How dare common soldiers flee? As the crossbowmen fled toward the rear, desperately trying to escape the arrow storm, French knights charged after them, not after the English. They were murdering their own hired soldiers. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of horror. The Count of Alençon, according to accounts, ordering the execution of his own Genoese soldiers because he perceived their retreat as shameful. French nobles were slaughtering the very men they'd hired to support them because those men were fleeing an impossible barrage. The French were literally killing their own army before the English had a chance to kill them. This chaos created an opportunity. The French cavalry charge became disorganized immediately, with some knights clearing the bodies of fleeing crossbowmen while others pushed forward. The first wave of French knights reached the English position. They charged uphill into the carefully prepared killing field. The sharpened stakes meant to impale horses did exactly that. Horses were driven directly onto the points, screaming, throwing their riders, creating chaos and confusion. The ditches and pits disrupted the charge's momentum. Some horses fell, some knights managed to dismount and advance on foot, but the compact formation of the cavalry charge had been broken into scattered individual combats. The organised military formation became scattered groups of individual fights. The English archers focused their fire on the horses now. A knight's armour could protect against arrows. A horse couldn't wear plate mail. Arrows struck horses, bringing them down, throwing riders into the mud. The English knights that Edward had forced to dismount stood their ground, fighting with sword and axe against French nobles now on foot, scrambling in the mud. The French launched 17 separate charges throughout that afternoon and evening. 17 different waves of knights threw themselves at the English position, most less coordinated than the one before. French nobles literally competed with each other to reach the front of the charge, jostling for the glory of fighting the English first, only to arrive at a position where the English archers had a completely clear field of fire. The archers methodically cut them down, horses fell, knights died. The mud became thick with blood and bodies, making movement increasingly difficult. Each charge accomplished less than the previous one because the body count increased, creating more obstacles, more positions for cavalry to stumble over. The field became a graveyard that attackers had to cross to reach their enemy. Then there was the blind King of Bohemia. John of Luxembourg was old, genuinely blind, and had somehow arrived at this battle despite being unable to see anything. When he heard the battle was ongoing and determined to be where the fighting was, his retinue took horses to both sides of his own horse. They would guide him toward the fighting by holding his horse's bridle on both sides. According to chronicles, as the battle raged, the blind king called out demanding to be led into the combat. He wanted to strike an enemy before he died. His handlers, horrified, tried to pull him back, but he insisted. The king would not be left on the sidelines. They led him and his horse forward directly into the English position, while arrows flew through the air. The king struck out with his sword blindly into the chaos, unable to see what he was hitting, just swinging into the noise and violence. He was killed in the engagement, one of the few specifically notable deaths at this battle. But his reputation for suicidal nobility became legendary among medieval chroniclers. He'd chosen to charge into battle despite blindness and age because remaining on the sidelines was unacceptable. He wanted to participate in the slaughter rather than observe it from safety. That's what nobility meant to him. You died fighting, or you didn't deserve the title. The Count of Alençon, who had ordered the killing of his own Genoese crossbowmen, charged repeatedly throughout the afternoon. Each time he approached the English lines, he was pushed back or killed. Chronicles describe him dying with an arrow through his face, struck down by the very common soldiers he'd viewed as beneath contempt just hours earlier. He lived long enough to see the irony of his death. As the sun sank lower, the French kept charging. The mud became worse, almost impassable, churned into thick soup by thousands of bodies and hooves. The slaughter continued mechanically. At one point the English ran out of arrows. They were firing so many missiles that their entire supply was exhausted. The archers had brought everything they had and fired it all. They resorted to using knives, mallets, and wooden stakes, literally beating the French knights to death in hand-to-hand combat. While those knights wore plate armour worth more than entire villages, English peasant archers were clubbing French nobles to death with sticks. The contrast was grotesque. A duke in armour worth £1,000 being beaten to death by a peasant with a wooden stake. Philip himself charged with one of the final waves as darkness approached. His horse was struck by arrows and fell beneath him. An arrow tore through his jaw, causing catastrophic injury. His personal guard physically dragged him from the battlefield as he struggled to continue fighting, blood pouring from his face. The King of France had been shot through the face and was bleeding out. The sacred oriflamme, the battle banner of France that supposedly guaranteed victory, was abandoned in the mud and lost. It was never recovered. As darkness fell, the English barely believed they'd won. They stayed in position all night, continuing to kill any wounded Frenchmen who attempted to move, taking no chances on a French counterattack that never came. They maintained their defensive position, exhausted, shocked, waiting to see if the French would attack again in the morning. They didn't. When dawn broke on August 27th, the scale of the slaughter became undeniable. The cream of French nobility lay dead in the mud. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, the Count of Sancerre. The list continued on and on. Over 1,500 nobles were dead, 11 princes, thousands of lesser knights. The Genoese crossbowmen who hadn't managed to flee were all dead, most killed by their own employers. The English casualties totalled around 40 men, with only 2 knights among them, 1 English knight for approximately 750 French nobles. The disparity was impossible. It couldn't be real. Yet it was. The mathematical disparity was so extreme that contemporary chroniclers refused to believe it. Some claimed divine intervention. God was protecting the English, punishing French pride. Others suggested that the numbers had been corrupted in retelling, that chroniclers had exaggerated to make the story more dramatic. But the reality was simpler than any supernatural explanation. The longbow had made heavy cavalry obsolete in a single afternoon. Technology and tactics had beaten courage and numbers. Simple mathematics had determined the outcome more than anything else. The truly devastating reality wasn't merely the deaths, though. It was who had died and how. Medieval warfare had long operated under a gentleman's agreement. You didn't kill nobles, you captured them for ransom. Nobles were worth money. Killing them meant losing that wealth. Common soldiers fought common soldiers. Nobles were supposed to be taken alive and ransomed back to their families. But at Crécy, the English archers, common men with no training in chivalric codes and even less respect for them, simply killed everyone. They put arrows through the faces of dukes and counts without knowing or caring who those men were. The psychological impact on European nobility was catastrophic. For 500 years, being a knight meant possessing military superiority. Noble blood, blessed by God, was supposed to make you better at warfare than commoners. Crécy demonstrated that any Welsh peasant with a stick could kill a duke, just as dead as another knight could. Military superiority didn't come from blood. It came from technology and tactics and training. That was a terrifying thought for the nobility. The entire social foundation of medieval Europe was shaken. If peasants could destroy nobles in open combat, what did that say about the divine right of nobility? If Welsh criminals could kill princes, what justified the feudal system? The psychological crisis ran deep through European aristocracy. The established order was being questioned. If the nobles didn't have military superiority, what made them nobles? The aftermath was grotesque and surreal. So many nobles had died that there weren't enough people of appropriate rank to bury them properly. Bodies lay rotting in the summer heat for days. Crows and wolves feasted on princely flesh. Local peasants looted the noble corpses, stripping them of armour, jewellery and fine clothing, finding enough wealth to transform their lives in a single day. The armour that couldn't save its wearers was melted down and sold for profit. The English army, exhausted and shocked by their own victory, continued their march toward Calais. They left behind a field so thick with noble corpses that locals renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold because of all the expensive, fine clothing covering the dead. For years afterward, Farmers ploughing that field would turn up noble bones and corroded armour, reminders of that single afternoon of slaughter. France entered into shock. The loss of so many nobles in a single day created a catastrophic power vacuum. Entire regions lost their lords. The administrative systems governing those territories collapsed. The chain of succession was disrupted in numerous places. The French military structure had to be completely rebuilt. They began hiring more crossbowmen and, most humiliatingly, copying English tactics. They formed their own archer corps and eventually adopted the practice of fighting on foot, abandoning their traditional reliance on mounted cavalry charges. The battle transformed the very nature of warfare itself. The dominance of the longbow meant that battles began taking place at greater ranges. The age of glorious cavalry charges was ending. Warfare became about positioning, preparation, and firepower rather than courage and close combat swordsmanship. The romance of medieval combat died in the mud at Crécy, but France didn't learn quickly enough. 10 years later, at Poitiers, the French launched an almost identical campaign against English forces. They charged English archers positioned on a hill. The results were nearly identical. They lost another king, John II was captured, and thousands more nobles died. It would take France nearly a century to fully adapt to the new military reality that common archers were more valuable than armoured knights. The social implications were profound and lasting. If peasant archers could destroy noble knights, what did that say about the divine, right of nobility? If criminals could kill princes, what justified the feudal system at all? The entire theological foundation supporting the feudal order was challenged. Crécy didn't just kill French nobles, it murdered the idea that noble blood meant military superiority. It murdered the concept that a warrior aristocracy had a divinely ordained right to dominate the battlefield. The English longbowmen became the most feared military unit in Europe. But here's the historical irony. The longbow's dominance was temporary. It required years of training to use effectively. You couldn't create longbowmen quickly. When gunpowder weapons arrived, which any peasant could learn to use competently in a single day, the longbow became obsolete too. The weapon that killed chivalry was itself destroyed by progress. The technology that could be learned overnight replaced the technology that required a lifetime of practice. The transition happened over a century, but it happened inevitably. The blind king of Bohemia's suicidal charge became legendary. His willingness to die fighting despite blindness and age became the symbolic representation of chivalric honour. He chose to charge into battle rather than remain on the sidelines. He wanted to strike an enemy before he died. His death represented the end of an era when nobility meant something beyond mere wealth, when honour truly mattered more than survival. Medieval chroniclers recorded his death as the most noble act of that battle, more significant than his side's devastating defeat. That a blind man on horseback, guided by his retinue into an impossible situation, became the symbol of nobility. Says something profound about how the nobility was beginning to redefine itself after being militarily defeated. If they could no longer dominate the battlefield through force, they could at least dominate it through nobility of spirit. Modern military historians study Crécy as a revolution in warfare. It proved that technology and tactics triumph over numbers and courage. It demonstrated that prepared defensive positions could obliterate mounted cavalry charges. It showed that coordinated firepower could dominate individual combat skills. Every fundamental principle of modern military science was demonstrated in that muddy field in 1346. Concentrated missile fire, defensive positioning, the elimination of the cavalry charge as the primary method of breaking enemy lines, preparation, discipline, and logistics beating improvisation and aristocratic bravado. Crécy was the birth of modern military science on a medieval battlefield. But the most haunting image from Crécy remains this: French knights, the proud elite of Christendom, trampling their own men to reach the English lines faster, only to die beneath a storm of arrows. English peasants stood calmly at the English lines, firing their bows as noble after noble fell before them, like wheat being cut by scythes. The Count of Alençon, who had ordered the slaughter of his own Genoese soldiers, was struck through the face by an arrow from one of those common soldiers moments later. The French literally killed more of their own men that day than the English lost in total. The crows that feasted on noble corpses grew so fat from the abundance of flesh that they could scarcely fly. waddling between corpses too heavy with digested human meat to take wing. It was a grotesque metaphor for the collapse of an entire social class. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crécy. Few tourists stop there. Most visitors pass by without understanding what happened on that slope. Yet on August 26, 1346, that muddy field witnessed the end of medieval warfare and the beginning of something new. 5 centuries of military tradition ended in an afternoon. The entire concept of warrior nobility died in the mud. The romance of chivalric combat was destroyed by common men with bent sticks and string. The English didn't just win a battle at Crécy. They proved that courage cannot defeat mathematics. They demonstrated that nobility cannot stop arrows. They showed that the age of mounted knights had definitively ended. France lost more than men that day. They lost their understanding of how the world worked, the fundamental belief that noble birth meant military superiority. All it took was 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church. 5,000 trained archers and one afternoon changed the course of history.